The gate guard saw her first. Three grown men, bleeding, barely conscious, draped across the shoulders of a single woman who looked like she'd crawled through hell and kept moving anyway. Her boots were shredded. Her left sleeve was soaked through, dark and stiff. A tactical dog walked beside her with the kind of stillness that made experienced soldiers step back, because that kind of stillness meant the animal had already seen everything worth fearing and decided none of it was worth running from. She didn't call for help. She didn't say a word. She just walked through the gate like she'd earned the right to be there, set the first man down on the gravel like he was made of glass, and looked up at the crowd forming around her with eyes that were exhausted and sharp and completely, terrifyingly calm. Then Captain Marcus Trent stepped forward, pressed uniform, clean hands, and pointed at her like she was the problem. "Restrain her. If you want to find out what really happened out there, stay with me until the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels." The morning had started the way bad days always start at Coldwater Forward Base, with paperwork and overconfidence, staff rotation notices, resupply manifests, a board covered in grid references and terrain overlays for Ravenspine Range, a stretch of mountain corridor so consistently hostile that most operators privately called it the graveyard and left it at that. The mission brief had gone smoothly. It always went smoothly in the briefing room. Everything made sense on a laminated map. It was the actual ground that had a habit of disagreeing. Nora Vass had been assigned to the strike team 6 days earlier as a temporary field medic. Her paperwork said as much, stamped and signed, and entirely unremarkable. She was 32 years old, with brown hair pulled back so tight it looked like a deliberate statement, and she had a way of sitting in a room that made most people look past her. Not small, not forgettable exactly, but she carried herself with the kind of quiet that tended to make people assume she was waiting for someone more important to speak first. She was not waiting for anything. She'd read the terrain briefing twice before the team leader, Lieutenant Cole Dagan, had even opened his folder. She'd noted the 3 topographic choke points where vehicle routes funneled into predictable lines. She'd looked at the communication relay positions and felt something she couldn't name sitting heavy in her chest, something adjacent to unease. She hadn't said anything. That was her first mistake. "Son." Ash rode in the back of the 3rd vehicle, seated between a crate of medical supplies and a quiet specialist named Torres who kept feeding the dog small pieces of jerky from his vest pocket. The dog was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, tri-trained in tracking, detection, and handler protection. His official designation was K9 Unit A7, but everyone called him Ash because of the pale gray patch across his muzzle that made him look like something that had walked out of a fire. He'd been partnered with Nora for 2 years. In those 2 years, nobody had ever seen him agitated without reason. So when the convoy entered the lower ridge access road and Ash stood up without being told to, pushing his nose against the small porthole window and going completely rigid, Torres stopped chewing and looked at Nora. Nora was already watching the tree line. The ambush hit 40 seconds later. Well, it came from the east slope first. Controlled bursts, disciplined spacing, not the scattered fire of an opportunistic attack. This was rehearsed. The lead vehicle took the brunt of it, and Nora registered the sound before she processed the impact. A sharp metallic crack, then another, then a sound like water through gravel that was actually glass. "Contact east." Dagan's voice cut through the radio and then cut off. The vehicle Nora was in slewed sideways as the driver overcorrected, right rear tire gone, the whole chassis dropping and grinding gravel. Torres was moving before they stopped, door open, weapon up, body behind the wheel arch. Nora grabbed her med bag with one hand and Ash's lead with the other, and stepped out onto ground that was already turning red. Dagan was down. He was face up in the road, and the way he wasn't moving, not the stillness of someone taking cover, but the absolute stillness of something final, told her everything she needed to know before she reached him. She checked anyway, checked fast and thorough. The round had caught him high in the chest and traveled in a direction that didn't leave options. She closed his eyes and moved to the next one. Specialist Vero was behind the engine block with a tourniquet on the wrong limb, white-faced and working on shock, his left leg bleeding through the fabric of his pants from mid-thigh. She ripped the incorrect tourniquet off, repacked the wound with her hands, felt the specific give of tissue that told her the femoral hadn't been caught, and applied pressure where it mattered. "Talk to me," she said. It came from... I know where it came from. What's your pain level? 8. Good. 8 means you're conscious. She secured the tourniquet 2 inches above the wound and locked it. Don't move that leg. Where are you going? She was already gone. The firefight had splintered across 30 meters of road and lower brush. 2 operators had pushed into the tree line. 1 had come back. Communications were down. Not degraded, not patchy, gone. The kind of clean absence that took equipment and planning, not just distance. Nora registered this between steps without breaking stride. Sergeant Obika was behind a boulder with a pressure bandage on his right shoulder that he'd applied himself, one-handed, correctly. She'd review it later. Right now she was moving toward the 3rd casualty, a breacher named Falk, who was sitting upright against a vehicle tire with the specific expression of a man who didn't yet understand how seriously he was hurt. Falk had a sucking chest wound. She heard it before she saw it. That wet pulling sound that meant the pleural cavity was compromised and every breath was doing damage. He was trying to speak. Don't, she said. She had the chest seal out of her kit in under 4 seconds, got the wound surface cleared with one hand while she positioned the seal with the other and got it seated. The sound changed. She watched his face, watched his color, counted. Stay still, she told him. You're just the medic. He said it without cruelty, more confusion than anything else, like he was trying to orient himself with whatever information he had. And you just got a tension pneumo that I need you to hold very still for. She produced a 14-gauge needle. This is going to feel like pressure. Don't move. She decompressed the chest cavity in darkness, an incoming fire with a hand that didn't shake. Falk exhaled, ragged, real, alive. She moved on. The firing had become sporadic but persistent, the attackers shifting position in a pattern she was already mapping in her peripheral awareness. Ash was working ahead of her, quartering the ground in short arcs, head low. He'd alerted twice on the eastern flank, and twice she'd redirected her own path, trusting him without needing an explanation. The dog had never been wrong about what was coming. Obika found her at the vehicle. He was functional. Shoulder wound dressed and held, weapon in his left hand, expression somewhere between professional and genuinely concerned. Dagon's gone, she told him. He processed that with one breath. Comms? Completely jammed. I don't know how far. Nearest support. Coldwater is the closest base. It's behind us. We have to go back the way we came. She paused, recalculating, looking at the ridge above them. No. They'll have that route covered. We go up and over. Obika looked at the ridge, then at the 3 wounded men, then back at her. Through the spine? Through the spine, she confirmed. Varro can walk with support. Falk needs to be carried. I'm going to stabilize him better first. That's going to take... I know how long it's going to take. Help me get Varro on his feet. It took 4 hours to reach the first real elevation. The terrain was brutal in the specific way that Ravenspine had a reputation for. Loose shale on top of wet clay, ridges that looked passable until you were on them and discovered a 20-foot drop on the other side, brush thick enough to force constant rerouting. Varro was mobile but slow, leaning on a makeshift brace Nora had fashioned from a broken radio mount and medical tape. Falk was on an improvised carry frame, and they rotated him between Obika and the one remaining operator who was still fully functional, a quiet man named Gress who moved like he'd grown up in mountains and didn't say a word unless the word mattered. Nora checked Falk every 40 minutes. She kept Ash close, reading his ears and his body position like a second data feed. Twice more he tensed, and she redirected without explaining it to the others. By the second redirection, they'd stopped asking. You done this before? Gress asked her, somewhere around hour 6, not looking at her, just speaking into the middle distance. Done what? This. He gestured vaguely at everything. Some version of it, she said. He didn't push further. She appreciated that. They stopped at a shallow outcropping around hour 8 to let Varro rest and to reassess Falk's chest. The seal was holding. His color was better than she'd expected, which meant the decompression had been effective and there was no secondary bleed developing. She repacked what she could, rationed the remaining pain management, and made a calculation she didn't voice aloud. If she was wrong about anything, the seal position, the internal pressure, the structural stability of the carry frame, Falk would deteriorate in a way that was going to be very hard to reverse. She wasn't wrong, but she sat with the possibility of it for a long moment in the dark, alone with the sound of Varro's uneven breathing and Ash warm against her side, and let herself acknowledge that she was tired in a way that went past physical, the kind of tired that sat behind the eyes and made everything feel slightly translated, like sound arriving a half-second after the source. She'd been here before. Not this mountain, not these men, but this particular exhaustion, yes. She ate half an energy bar, gave the other half to Ash, and stood up. "Let's go," she said. At hour 11, they hit trouble, not enemy contact, something worse in its own way. Falk's frame had developed a structural failure in the right support, and in the process of stopping to fix it, Varro's improvised brace had shifted and he'd gone down hard on a loose slope, aggravating the thigh wound and reopening the edge of it. Not catastrophic, but sudden and bleeding and requiring immediate attention in failing light with one functional headlamp between 4 people. Nora handled Varro first. Pressure, reassessment, resecure, while Obika and Gress rebuilt the carry frame with whatever they could strip from their own gear. She heard them working behind her, heard Obika's clipped instructions, and the clink of metal, and didn't turn around. "You should have been an engineer," Varro said, not entirely seriously, watching her work. "I was an EMT first," she said, which was technically accurate and also deeply incomplete. "Then what?" She cut a length of medical tape with her teeth. "Then other things." Varro studied her face with the particular focus of someone who has nothing to do except be in pain and notice what's in front of them. "You're not scared," he said. "Not even a little." She glanced up at him. "I'm scared." "You don't look it." "I learned not to look it." She secured the dressing and checked her watch. "Can you put weight on it?" He tried. He could. "Then we move," she said. "Bam." They cleared the last ridge at hour 13. From the high point, Coldwater Base was visible as a cluster of lights in the valley below. Distant but real. The kind of real that meant something different after 13 hours. Varro saw it first and made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Gress put his hand briefly on the man's shoulder and then took it away without comment. Nora looked at the lights and thought, downhill. Rough terrain still, but gravity working for them instead of against. Falk's vitals had held. Obika's shoulder was stiff and bruised, but the wound hadn't reopened. The frame was solid. She looked at Ash. Ash looked at her. They went down. Well, it was just past 3 in the morning when they reached the perimeter road, and the gate guard was a young corporal who had very clearly been having a quiet night and was not remotely prepared for what he was now looking at. Nora crossed the threshold with Varro's arm over her shoulder and Falk's frame gripped in her right hand, Gressa managing the other side. Obika brought up the rear with Ash at his heel, which was strange enough on its own. Ash didn't heel for anyone except Nora. The guard's mouth opened. "Get your base medical staff in a stretcher," Nora said. 2 stretchers. Tell them one is a chest wound with a tension pneumodecompression, held with a valve seal, needs imaging immediately. The other is a femoral wound, tourniquet applied at... She checked her watch. 11 hours, 43 minutes ago. You need to tell them that exact number. Do you understand? Yes. He was already reaching for his radio. Go. He went. The crowd gathered faster than she'd expected. By the time they'd moved 20 meters inside the gate, there were soldiers on all sides, some in full kit, some half-dressed, all staring. The look on most of their faces was the particular combination of relief and confusion that she associated with people who had expected bad news and were now recalibrating. She kept walking. She didn't look up. Hold! The voice came from ahead and to the left, and it carried the specific tone of authority that had spent years being obeyed. She looked up. Captain Marcus Trent was standing in the path with 2 security personnel behind him and an expression she recognized immediately. The look of a man who had already decided what was happening before he'd gathered any information to support the decision. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, the kind of officer whose uniform was always immaculate in a way that suggested he considered it a moral position. She had known men like him. She had navigated men like him before. "Field medic assigned to Strike Team 7, she said. "We need medical support for 3 casualties, sir." Trent looked past her at Vero and Falk and Obika, and the look on his face didn't change. "Where's Dagan?" "Lieutenant Dagan is KIA. Enemy contact, Ravenspine Eastern Corridor, approximately 13 hours ago." "You were at the contact point." "I was." "And you retreated." She felt Vero tense against her shoulder. "I extracted 3 wounded personnel across Ravenspine Ridge under active fire." "I don't have confirmation of that." "Sir," Gressa said from behind her, and the flatness in his voice was remarkable. Trent ignored him. He was looking at Nora with a focus that had nothing to do with assessing her report and everything to do with something she couldn't quite name yet. Something personal. "You left the mission area." "I stayed with the casualties." Dagan's orders were to hold position. Dagan was dead. She kept her voice even. She was aware of every person watching. Holding position with 3 critically wounded personnel and no communications would have resulted in 4 deaths instead of 1. That's not your call to make. Someone had to make it. Trent took a step forward. "Drop what you're carrying and stand clear. These men need to be assessed by proper personnel." "They need to be assessed right now," she said, "which is why I'd appreciate it if we moved this conversation after they were on stretchers. You don't dictate the timeline here. The chest wound does." She looked at him with something that wasn't defiance. Not quite. More like the patience of someone who has stopped expecting people to act well and has simply prepared contingencies. 12 hours with a valve seal, Captain. Every minute we stand here is a minute he's not in imaging." Trent's jaw moved. "Stand her down," he said to the security personnel. Neither of them moved immediately. The one on the right was looking at Vero's leg. "Sir?" The one on the right started. "I said stand her down." Nora looked past Trent at the 2 security personnel, then at the crowd, then at the growing cluster of base medical staff who had appeared at the edge of the gathering and were visibly unsure whether to push forward. She made a decision. She walked forward. Not aggressively. She didn't have to. She simply continued moving toward the medical staff with Vero's weight on her shoulder, and the people in the crowd parted instinctively, the way people part for someone carrying something fragile and urgent. Trent moved to intercept. Ash stepped between them. The dog didn't growl, didn't show teeth. He simply positioned himself with a stillness that was more effective than aggression, and Trent stopped. Not out of fear exactly. The captain's expression shifted through several things quickly, but out of the basic calculus of a large trained animal between his body and his objective. The medical staff reached her. "Chest wound first," Nora said, and they moved. She spent the next 40 minutes in motion. She briefed the base surgeon, a lieutenant colonel named Harwick, 50-ish, gray at the temples, who asked questions in the rapid cadence of someone who genuinely needed the answers, while simultaneously monitoring Vero's transfer and providing the injury timeline for Falk that the surgical team needed before they could proceed. She had kept mental notes of every intervention, every timestamp, every medication she'd administered and in what quantity, and she delivered it all in ordered sequence without hesitation. Harwick looked at her once in the middle of this, briefly, with an expression she couldn't read. Decompressed a pneumothorax in the field? 14-gauge, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, she confirmed. He was declining fast. Seal held 13 hours? Plus transit time. I checked it every 40 minutes. He looked at her again. What did you say your name was? Vas. Nora Vasis. He wrote it down. Something in the deliberateness of the gesture made her pay attention to it. Then Falk was taken through the doors, and her access ended there, and she was standing in a corridor that was too bright after 13 hours of darkness, with blood on her hands and a dog sitting at her feet. Trent found her 40 minutes later. She was in a supply corridor, seated on a crate, eating another half ration and drinking water from a bottle someone had left on a shelf. Ash was lying across her feet, which was a habit he'd had since he was 6 months old and which she'd never seen the point of discouraging. Her vest was off and hanging on a hook. Her arms were visibly bruised from the carry frame. Trent came in with 2 base security officers and a corporal with a recording device. Nora Vass, he said. Temporary medical attachment. Strike Team 7. That's right. You are being formally charged with dereliction of duty, abandoning your assigned post during active engagement, and failure to render appropriate command notification in the absence of unit leadership. She ate the last piece of the ration bar. Additionally, he said, your K-9 unit interfered with a security operation. That's a separate citation. Ash did not react to this. He appeared to be asleep. Do you understand these charges as stated? I understand what you're saying, she said. That's not the same as an answer. No, she agreed. It isn't. Trent's expression sharpened. There was something beneath the procedural surface of this. She'd been watching for it since the gate. This wasn't only about protocol. This was a man who had looked at her and made a specific personal decision about what she was, and was now executing it. The charges were real enough, in the sense that he could make them real, could put them in a file and build something with them. She was a temporary attachment with no immediate unit chain to advocate for her. Dagan was dead. Gresse and Obika were still in medical assessment and hadn't been interviewed yet. She was, at this exact moment, exactly as isolated as he needed her to be. You'll be confined to base pending investigation, he said. If the surviving operators corroborate your account, we'll reassess. If not, he left the space after that deliberate. You're looking at a very short career from here. What about the ambush? She said. He blinked. What? The ambush. The communications blackout was total, Captain. Not weather, not terrain degradation, total. Someone jammed us before we reached the corridor, and the route we took. I was told the day before departure that Strike Team 7 was using grid route Delta 9. We used route Foxtrot 7. Who changed that? Silence. That's a mission planning question, Trent said. It's a relevant one. That's above your clearance level. She looked at him. Whose clearance level is it at? Something crossed his face that she filed carefully. It wasn't guilt. Not exactly. It was a version of alertness that people developed when they became aware that a conversation was recording something they hadn't intended to say. You're confined to base, he said. Turn over your med pack and your sidearm. My sidearm is in my vehicle. The vehicle was left at the contact point. Then it's at the contact point. A pause. The K-9 goes to the base kennel. The K-9 stays with me. That's not your decision. Try, she said quietly, to put him somewhere without me. Trent looked at Ash. Ash opened one eye. Corporal, Trent said. Log that the subject is confined to temporary quarters, Building 6. She is not to access communications equipment, base operations, or mission planning facilities. He paused. And someone find out who authorized this woman for Strike Team 7. He left. The corporal lingered for a moment, looking at Nora with an expression that was not quite professional neutrality. Ma'am, he said. Then quietly, Specialist Falk's in surgery. They're saying he's going to make it. She nodded. He left. She sat there for a moment in the too bright corridor with Ash's weight on her feet, and she thought about the route change. About who would have access to alter a mission route at 12 hours' notice. About 14 months of field reports she had personally flagged with concerns that had gone nowhere. Not lost, she didn't think, but somewhere. Held somewhere. Waiting. About what Trent's face had done when she asked the question. She reached into the inner pocket of her vest, the one she hadn't surrendered because Trent hadn't specifically asked for it, and she hadn't volunteered it, and removed a small drive no bigger than her thumbnail. It had been there since the morning. She had taken it from the mission command vehicle before she'd started moving casualties, in the specific and quiet way that people act when something in them has already calculated that they might need it later. She'd spent most of the 13-hour extraction not thinking about it at all, the way you don't look at a card you've already played. She turned it over once, then she looked at Ash. Ash was watching the door. His ears were not relaxed. Ash's ears didn't move. That was the thing about the dog that most people never understood. It wasn't the growling or the alerting or the dramatic posture that mattered. It was the stillness before any of that. The particular quality of attention that settled over him like a change in air pressure, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for. Nora had learned to read it the way sailors learn to read a horizon, not for what was there, but for what was coming. She pocketed the drive and stood up. Her knees ached in the specific way that said the adrenaline was done metabolizing and her body was beginning its accounting of the night. Left shoulder stiff, two ribs that moved wrong when she breathed too deep, boots that had soaked through somewhere on the upper ridge and then dried against her feet in a way that was going to leave marks. She cataloged these the way she cataloged everything, noted, filed, not acted on yet. She put her vest back on. Building 6 was a temporary billet block on the eastern edge of the base, the kind used for attached personnel and transient teams, people the base tolerated but hadn't allocated permanent space to, which told her something about how Trent had thought about her before any of this happened. She found the room, 8 feet by 10, a cot, a locker with a broken latch, a light that buzzed if you left it on too long, and stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. Ash went straight to the corner and lay down facing the door. She sat on the cot and looked at the drive in her palm. It was a standard mission data unit, the kind used to log contact reports, communications logs, and navigation data for post-mission review. She'd taken it from the command vehicle's secondary slot in the 4 minutes between confirming Dagan's death and moving to Vero. She hadn't thought about it consciously. It was the kind of action that happened when the part of you that tracked threats was working faster than the part of you that narrated your own decisions. What she needed was a read terminal. What she had was a locked room and standing orders confining her to it. She lay back on the cot without taking her boots off and looked at the ceiling. The buzz of the light was faintly irritating. She didn't turn it off. The route change kept coming back. Strike Team 7's pre-mission brief had specified Grid Route Delta 9, a northern access corridor that was longer but offered better cover on both flanks and 2 defensible ridge positions if contact was made. Foxtrot 7 was the shorter, faster route, valley floor, predictable lines, exactly the kind of ground you used when you wanted speed and weren't expecting trouble. Or exactly the kind of ground you used when you wanted someone else to find a specific team at a specific time. She'd noticed the deviation when the convoy turned south instead of north at the second waypoint. She'd been in the 3rd vehicle with Torres, and she'd watched the route marker pass on her window side and thought, that's not right. Then Torres had fed Ash another piece of jerky, and the radio had crackled with something routine, and she'd filed it as a planning adjustment. The kind of last-minute change that happened constantly in field operations and usually meant nothing. Usually. The ambush had been positioned on Foxtrot 7. Not Delta 9, not in the middle of both routes as a hedge, specifically, precisely, on the route the team hadn't been assigned until sometime in the 18 hours before departure. She closed her eyes and ran the math she'd been avoiding. But she slept for 3 hours without meaning to. Ash woke her by standing up, and she came out of it fast. Not the gradual surfacing of normal sleep, but the immediate, full systems online return of someone who had trained their body to treat sleep as a brief system reboot rather than a recovery state. She was sitting up before she was fully conscious and reaching for a weapon she'd already surrendered. Ash was facing the door. Knuckles on the frame. Not a knock exactly. More deliberate. The kind of sound that announced itself as non-threatening while still communicating that the person making it wasn't going away. Was? Female voice. Unfamiliar. Nora looked at Ash. His tail moved once. Not a threat. Come in, she said. The door opened on a woman in her mid-40s, no insignia visible, wearing a base-issue jacket over civilian clothes that suggested she'd dressed quickly. She had the kind of face that had settled into itself. Not tired, not hard, but settled, like someone who had stopped performing composure and simply had it. She carried a tablet and a covered cup that she set on the broken-latched locker without asking. Coffee's probably wrong temperature, she said. Sorry. Who are you? Colonel Dina Marsh, Base Intelligence Liaison. She pulled the single chair over and sat in it backwards, arms resting on the back. Don't look for my insignia. I don't wear it at 4 in the morning. Nora picked up the coffee. It was too hot, which was fine. What does Intelligence Liaison want with a confined field medic? I want to know what you saw on Ravenspine. Marsh's voice was direct without being hard. Specifically, the ambush positioning and the communications blackout. That sounds like a debrief. Trent's people already logged my confinement. This isn't Trent's debrief. Marsh looked at her steadily. The blackout lasted 4 hours and covered a radius of approximately 11 kilometers. We had 2 other teams in adjacent corridors who were also affected. The jamming source has been preliminarily triangulated to a position inside Ravenspine's ridgeline, which means it was placed there in advance. Nora said nothing. That's not consistent with an opportunistic ambush, Marsh said. No, Nora agreed. It isn't. What else did you notice? She thought about the drive in her pocket, about what it might or might not contain, about the fact that she'd been in a room for 3 hours with her communications access revoked by a man who had, when she'd asked about the route change, looked at her with an alertness that was adjacent to alarm. Why are you here instead of in a formal setting? Nora asked. Marsh's expression didn't shift. Because formal settings create paper trails that are visible to people I'm not sure I trust right now. Well, that was either the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 36 hours or a precisely engineered version of honesty designed to open her up. She looked at Marsh the way she looked at terrain, not for what was on the surface, but for what the surface suggested about what was underneath. Ash had gone back to lying down. She made a decision. The route was changed, she said, between final briefing and departure. Strike Team 7 was assigned Delta 9. We ran Foxtrot 7. Marsh was very still. The ambush was staged on Foxtrot 7, Nora continued. The positioning suggested they knew the route and expected our timeline, not a general patrol ambush, a specific intercept. She paused. Someone with mission planning access changed the route, and someone else was waiting on the other end of it. The colonel set her tablet down on her knee without looking at it. How long have you been running through this? 13 hours in the mountains. So, Marsh almost smiled. It didn't quite make it. Captain Trent has already filed a formal complaint regarding your conduct at the gate. He's framed it as a security concern, an unconfirmed attachment returning from a compromised mission with unverified intentions. That's creative. He also flagged your access to the mission command vehicle in his initial incident report. Marsh met her eyes. He's specifically noted that items may have been removed. Nora drank her coffee. Vas, Marsh said, not unkindly. If you have something from that vehicle, the window for it to be useful rather than incriminating is narrowing. What are you offering? I'm not offering anything. I'm telling you what I know. Marsh stood and retrieved her tablet. Gresse and Obika are being interviewed in an hour. They've both independently requested that their statements include commendation of your conduct during the extraction. She paused by the door. Trent has already tried to have those statements deferred. He was overruled. She left without ceremony. Nora sat with the coffee for a moment. Then she pulled out the drive. But she needed a terminal. The billet block had 2 shared-use workstations in the common room at the end of the corridor. Standard base setup for temporary personnel, limited access, but enough for what she needed. She'd been confined to base, not confined to her room. Trent had specified Building 6. He hadn't specified her room. She went at 5 in the morning when the corridor was empty and the workstation room held 1 person, a young signals specialist who was clearly on a night shift wind-down, eating something from a foil packet and watching nothing in particular on the screen in front of him. He looked up when she came in. She sat at the second terminal. Working late? He said. Early, she said. He went back to his screen. The drive's contents loaded in under a minute. She scanned the index with the controlled speed of someone who had learned to read data the way a doctor reads an X-ray, not word by word but in shapes, looking for the thing that was wrong with the picture. The communications log was there. Navigation data, time-stamped, standard. The route data showed Delta 9 as the original assignment. It showed the modification to Foxtrot 7 logged at 23:47 hours the night before departure. Not in the standard mission update channel, but in a secondary administrative access field that typically handled supply adjustments and personnel attachments. Someone had put a route change in a supply channel. That didn't happen by accident. The authorization code attached to the modification resolved to a user designation she didn't recognize. She wrote it on her palm with a pen she found next to the terminal. 4 digits and a letter. VK441R. She ejected the drive and palmed it. "Night," she said to the signal specialist. "Early," he said, without looking up. Gress found her before breakfast. He came to the billet room door and knocked with the same controlled knock Marsh had used, and when she opened it, he was standing in clean clothes with his arm in a sling she hadn't seen him acquire, and an expression that was somewhere between careful and direct. "They're saying you abandoned the mission," he said. "I know. Obika and I told them what happened. I know that too." He looked at her steadily. He had the kind of face that didn't move much, but communicated clearly anyway. "What Trent is doing isn't about procedure. I'm aware. He was the one who did the pre-departure final check. Gressa said it the way you say something you've been deciding whether to say. Flat, without emphasis, like he was just putting a fact on a table. Mission planning. About 14 hours before we rolled out. I saw him in the planning room when I was turning in my weapons card." She processed this quietly. "Did you tell Marsh?" "Marsh wasn't in my debrief. She'll be in the next one." Gress nodded once. "Falk's out of surgery," he said. "They're saying he keeps the lung. It's going to be a long recovery, but—" He stopped. "He wanted me to tell you." She nodded. Gress turned to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said, still not looking back. "I've been in combat medicine situations before. Field decompression under fire is—" He paused. "I've seen it go wrong a lot of times. What you did in the dark, with what you had, was—" Another pause. He seemed to be discarding one word after another. "I just wanted you to know I noticed." He left. She sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find Marsh. She didn't find Marsh. What she found instead was a changed situation. The way situations on military bases could change between 4 in the morning and 7, which was that Trent had been busy. She got the shape of it from 2 separate sources within 40 minutes. First from a base clerk who walked past her in the corridor with the kind of studiously neutral expression that meant he'd been told something and was working very hard not to show it, and second from a physical notice posted to the door of Building 6's common room. Temporary attached personnel shall, VAS and N, to report to Base Security Office 3 at 0800 hours. She read it twice. The language was formal and specifically framed. Not a debrief request, not an interview. A security office report. That meant Trent had escalated from confinement to formal security review, which had different procedural teeth. It meant documentation. It meant that whatever came out of that room at 800 could potentially follow her in ways that confinement wouldn't. It also meant she had 50 minutes. She went back to her room and looked at Ash. "I need you to stay," she told him. Ash stared at her. "I'm serious. Don't bite anyone unless they deserve it." She left before he could register his objection. Malten. The base medical wing was quieter in the early morning. The nighttime urgency settled into the lower-grade hum of monitoring and maintenance. Harwick was still there, which surprised her until she remembered the kind of surgeon who stayed with a patient through the night, and then realized it probably shouldn't have surprised her at all. He was in a small office adjacent to post-op, reviewing what looked like imaging reports, and he looked up when she knocked on the open door. "Vas," he said. "Sir, I need 2 minutes." He studied her for a moment. He had the energy of someone who'd been awake too long but had made peace with it. "Close the door." She did. Falk's chest. I decompressed at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, 14 gauge. Did the imaging confirm the seal position? It confirmed. You were exactly right. He set down the imaging report, which is interesting because field decompression in those conditions, in the dark, under fire, with improvised technique, I had a headlamp. 1 headlamp, he said. The positioning was precise, textbook, actually. He paused. Who trained you? She was quiet for a beat. Can I ask you something different first? You can ask. The code VK441R. Does that designation mean anything in base medical records? Personnel assignments? Something shifted in his expression. Controlled, but she caught it. That's outside medical. I know. Where did you get it? Mission Command Vehicle data. She watched him. It's attached to a route modification logged in a supply channel at 23:47 hours the night before our departure. Harwick set down his pen. He looked at her for a long time. You should be careful about where you take that, he said. I'm taking it to a security review at 0800. No, he said. You shouldn't do that. I don't have a choice. Trent is the one who requested the security review, Harwick said. He's also the one who will be in that room. He let that sit. Marsh reached out to me at 0600. She asked me to find you if I saw you before 8. What does Marsh want? She wants you to not walk into that room with what you have and hand it to the wrong people. He picked up his pen again and wrote something on a small notepad. Tore it off. This is where she is. Marsh was in a vehicle. Specifically, she was in a gray base utility truck parked on the maintenance road behind the motor pool, engine off, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder that she appeared to be treating as the most important object in the world. She didn't look surprised when Nora got in the passenger side. Harwick found you, Marsh said. He did. Show me. Nora produced the drive. Marsh took it, plugged it into a reader she already had in her jacket pocket, and read for 60 seconds without speaking. The authorization code came up. Marsh looked at it for 4 seconds longer than she looked at anything else on the screen. VK441R, she said. You know it. Marsh ejected the drive and gave it back. It's an internal logistics designation. It shouldn't have access to mission route data. She looked out through the windshield at the motor pool fence. It shouldn't exist in a route modification at all. But you know who it belongs to. I know who had access to it. Marsh picked up her thermos and put it down without opening it. This base has an intelligence oversight officer attached to it. Has been for 14 months. Nominal role is mission quality review and resource allocation. She paused. His name is Dalton Frey. He has an office inside headquarters building. 14 months. Nora thought about the report she'd filed, about the patterns she'd flagged, compromised routes, communication anomalies, ambushes that felt less opportunistic and more calibrated with each iteration, filed and forwarded and not followed up on until she'd stopped expecting follow-up and had started keeping her own records. Frey, she said. He's been pushing to have the mission data from the Ravenspine operation formally sealed pending review, Marsh said. Filed the request at 0230 this morning, before Trent filed his security review request. Yes. They're working together. Marsh was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't have an answer, but the quiet of someone choosing how much of one to give. I don't have evidence of direct coordination yet, she said carefully. What I have is a pattern of access logs that are inconsistent with both of their stated roles. But you believe it. I believe that this morning is going to determine whether any of this sees daylight, Marsh said. Trent's 0800 review is designed to formalize your status as a security concern. Once that's in a record, anything you produce from that drive gets contextualized as self-serving. Your credibility becomes the story instead of the data. Nora looked at the drive. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that I need this drive in the hands of someone above Trent's authority before 0800. Marsh finally opened the thermos. There's one person on this base who has that authority and who hasn't been in contact with Trent or Frey since the Ravenspine incident. Who? Marsh drank her coffee. General Voss arrives at Coldwater at 0720 for a scheduled operational review. He has no standing relationship with Trent. His aide is a colonel I've worked with for 3 years. She looked at Nora. He lands in 40 minutes. And you want to get this to him before 8. I want to get you in front of him before 8, Marsh corrected. The drive is evidence. You're the context. She paused. There are things on your record that are relevant to this conversation that I think the general should hear from you directly. My record's clean. Your recent record is. Marsh set her coffee down. Your full record is sealed above a clearance level that Trent doesn't have, which is why he can't understand why you make the decisions you make in the field, and why he keeps framing you as a problem instead of recognizing you as a threat to his operation. Nora sat with this. He thinks I'm nothing, she said. He thinks you're a temporary field medic who got lucky and is now causing paperwork. Marsh picked up her thermos again. He hasn't checked what's in the sealed section. Why haven't you told him? Because the sealed section isn't mine to share. Marsh looked at her steadily. But the general's clearance covers it, and when he reads it, the entire frame of this changes. The helicopter came in at 0717. Nora was standing on the edge of the landing area with Marsh and a colonel named Watts, who had the efficient energy of someone who managed a senior officer's schedule. With the same focus, a battlefield medic gave a critical wound. He'd taken the drive from Nora 3 minutes earlier and looked at it with an expression that was carefully neutral and told her nothing except that he was very good at telling her nothing. General Voss was in his mid-60s, compact, the kind of frame that had been muscular 20 years ago and was now simply dense. He came off the helicopter with 2 aides and crossed the tarmac in a way that suggested he had already been awake for several hours and considered that normal. He shook Marsh's hand without breaking stride. "Walk with me," he said. They walked. Marsh gave him the operational summary in under 4 minutes. Ambush, casualties, extraction, route anomaly, the drive, the authorization code. Voss listened without interrupting, which in her experience was rare at his rank than it should have been. He took the drive from Watts and turned it in his hand without looking at it. "Dagan," he said. "Yes, sir," Marsh said. "KIA at point of contact." Voss looked at Nora. It was the first time he'd looked directly at her. "You carried 3 men across Ravenspine." "Yes, sir." "In how long?" 14 hours and change. He continued looking at her with the kind of attention that didn't feel like assessment so much as recognition. "Former Staff Sergeant Vass," he said. "Your sealed file came up about 6 hours ago when my aide started pulling background on the Ravenspine incident." She kept her expression neutral. "Medical Special Operations," he said. "Long-range extraction. You trained under the 11th Advanced Trauma Program." It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "And you've been filing operational anomaly reports for 14 months." "Yes, sir." "They didn't go anywhere." "No," he said. "They didn't." He looked at the drive once. "They do now." The 0800 security review happened without her. She found out from Watts, who appeared at the billet room door at 0805 with the contained expression of someone delivering information that was satisfying to deliver. Trent had presented his case to a room that contained not only the security officer he'd expected, but also Colonel Marsh and an aide from General Voss's office. The security review had been converted, on Voss's standing order, to a preliminary inquiry into mission planning irregularities for the Ravenspine operation. "Trent didn't know until he walked in," Watts said. Nora said nothing. "He's still in there," Watts added. Marsh had questions. She sat on the cot. Ash was asleep. She should also sleep. She was aware that the thing moving through her right now, not satisfaction, not relief, something adjacent to both and also neither, was a form of adrenaline that would leave her worse off if she didn't manage it. She'd seen people come down from this kind of sustained alert and do stupid things in the crash, make decisions they wouldn't have made on a full night's sleep. She wasn't going to do that. "What happens to the drive?" she asked. "Chain of evidence now," Watts said. "Formal copies made, original logged." "And Frey?" Watts paused. "Headquarters building has been restricted pending access log review. Is he still on base?" "As of 20 minutes ago, yes." Another pause. "Why?" She looked at Ash. His ears were up. She stood. "Where's headquarters from here?" she said. Watts frowned. "Building 4, north of the motor pool. Why?" She was already moving. "Vass?" Watts said behind her. She didn't stop. She crossed the corridor and pushed through the billet block's exterior door into the early morning air, still cold, the sun not fully up yet. The base in that particular state of between things that preceded a workday. Ash was beside her. She'd taken him without thinking about it, the way she did everything she did with him, because he was always either right or useful, and usually both. She didn't have a specific reason for moving. She had the feeling she'd learned over years to treat as data, the pressure behind the eyes that meant the situation was shifting faster than the visible information suggested, that something was in motion that hadn't shown up yet in any formal report. Ash's pace matched hers exactly, head up, nostrils working. The headquarters building was 150 meters ahead. She was halfway there when Ash accelerated, not toward the building, toward the east vehicle gate, the smaller secondary exit used primarily for maintenance and logistics vehicles. He broke ahead of her in the controlled, purposeful sprint that she recognized as a track, not an alert, not a warning, but a lock. He had a target, and he was already moving on it. She ran. The east gate came into view, and she saw it. A base vehicle. Gray utility truck identical to the one she'd been sitting in with Marsh 2 hours ago. Moving toward the gate at a speed that was technically within base limits but had the deliberate character of something trying not to be noticed. In the back, partially obscured by a canvas covering, was a hard case. Black. Tactical dimensions. The gate guard waved it through. "Stop that vehicle," she said. The guard looked at her. "Ma'am, stop it." She was already moving past him. Ash hit the road in front of the truck. The vehicle braked. Nora came around the driver's side. The window was up. She looked at the driver. Mid-40s, base uniform, the kind of face that was professionally blank in a way that only worked when no one was paying attention. She looked at the case in the back. Then she looked at him. "Open the door," she said. He didn't move. "Ash?" she said. The dog was already at the passenger door. The driver opened his door. He was holding a case handle, the kind with a combination lock, and there was a phone in his jacket pocket with the screen lit. He looked at Nora the way people looked at her when they'd underestimated her and were recalculating in real time. "Step out," she said. He stepped out, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He ran. Not for the gate, toward the interior of the base, toward the buildings, toward the spaces between things. "Ash," she said. The dog went. She didn't run. She didn't need to. 30 seconds later, Ash had him against the wall of the nearest building, not biting, not attacking, simply present, immovably between the man and wherever he was trying to go, in the way that a well-trained dog communicated. "You are not going anywhere, and I have time." Nora walked over. The case was in the truck. She could see it through the open door, the combination lock facing up. She didn't touch it. She pulled out the phone Watts had given her and made the call. The man on the ground looked up at her. His breathing was controlled, which told her he'd had training of some kind. His face was still blank, but underneath the blank was something working fast. "You don't understand what this protects," he said. She looked down at him. "You sold soldiers for strategy," she said. He opened his mouth. Watts and 2 base security officers came around the corner at a run. Ash didn't move until she told him to. The man on the ground looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not fear, not anger, but the specific look of someone who had built a structure they believed was impenetrable, watching the first load-bearing wall come down. The case was still in the truck. Watts reached her. He looked at the man on the ground, at Ash, at the truck, and then at her face, which was doing nothing in particular. "Frey," Watts said. "Yes," Nora said. "How did you—" He stopped. She looked at Ash. Ash had known at 4 a.m. in the billet room while she was sitting on a cot turning a drive over in her hands. He'd known before she did, the way he always did, because he read things she couldn't read and had learned to wait for her to catch up. She looked at the case in the truck. Watts was already calling it in. She stood in the early morning cold and breathed and thought about 14 months of reports and about a route that had been changed in a supply channel by someone who believed that people were assets to be spent and accounted for when the math worked out. About Dagan, who had died not knowing that the ground beneath the mission had been rearranged before he ever stepped on it. About Vero and Falk and Obika, who were alive because a woman that nobody had bothered to properly look at had carried them through a mountain range in the dark. She was very tired. Behind her, on the other side of the base, in the security review room, Captain Marcus Trent was answering questions he hadn't prepared for. She didn't know that yet. But Ash turned toward the base headquarters, lifted his head in that particular way, and held very still. She looked where he was looking. Whatever Ash was reading in the direction of headquarters, Nora didn't get the chance to follow. Watts put a hand up, not stopping her exactly, but redirecting, and spoke into his radio with the clipped efficiency of someone who had just upgraded a situation's classification in real time. 2 more security officers appeared from the motor pool within 90 seconds, which told her the response protocols had already been elevated before she'd stopped Frey's vehicle. Something had been in motion before she'd moved. She'd just accelerated it. "Stay here," Watts said. "I'm not going to stay here." He looked at her with the expression of a man who had spent a career managing the gap between what he wanted and what was realistic. "Then stay close," he said, which was a different thing, and she accepted it. Frey was on his feet, wrists bound with a flex cuff, being moved toward the security building with a speed that suggested nobody wanted him standing in an open area with a phone signal. The hard case was out of the truck and in the hands of a technical officer who was treating it the way you treated unexploded material, carefully, without rushing, without touching anything you hadn't mentally cataloged first. Nora watched them carry it past and felt the morning tilt slightly around her. 14 months. Whatever was in that case had been built over 14 months, assembled piece by someone who'd had access and patience and a working theory that the people around him weren't paying close enough attention. He hadn't been wrong about that last part. She followed Watts toward headquarters. The building had been locked down with the specific controlled tension of a place where everyone knew something had happened, but the exact shape of it was still resolving. Personnel moved in the corridors with a slightly elevated awareness. Not panic, not even urgency exactly, but the heightened focus of people who had been told to be at their stations and were being very careful about what they said out loud. Voss was in the primary operations room with Marsh and 2 officers Nora didn't recognize, standing in front of a wall display that showed the Ravenspine corridor in topographic detail, the ambush site marked with a red indicator, the extraction route overlaid in a second color. Dagan's name was in a box in the upper right corner of the display. She noticed it immediately and then stopped noticing it, the way you had to stop noticing things in order to function. Voss looked up when she came in. He looked at Watts first, then at her. "Frey's in custody," Watts said. "Case?" "Technical is opening it now. Preliminary look suggests it's a data assembly. Multiple drives. Documentation. Physical records." Voss absorbed this in about 1 second. "Who stopped him?" Watts looked at Nora. Voss looked at Nora. She said nothing, which wasn't modesty so much as accuracy. She hadn't stopped him, Ash had, and that felt like a meaningful distinction. "Sit down," Voss said. Not an order, not quite. The kind of instruction that acknowledged someone had been on their feet for too long. She didn't sit. He noticed and let it go. "The case contents are going to take time to process," Marsh said. She had a tablet in her hand and was moving through something quickly. "But the access logs from headquarters are already telling a story. Frey had administrative access to mission planning systems through a liaison designation that's been in place for 14 months. He wasn't flagged because his access pattern was consistent enough month to month that it read as routine. Until the route change, Nora said. Until the route change, Marsh confirmed. He got greedy with the timeline. 12 hours isn't enough buffer. A route change that close to departure should have triggered a planning review, and it didn't because he put it in a supply channel where the automated flags don't run. Almost worked, one of the other officers said, not approvingly. Almost, Marsh agreed. Voss looked at the display, at Dagan's name. Who was being protected, he said. This operation wasn't random. Someone contracted this. The room was quiet. That's going to be in the case, Marsh said carefully. I know it's going to be in the case. Voss's voice stayed level. I'm asking who your working theory is right now, in this room, before the case. Another pause. Then Marsh said a name that Nora didn't recognize, attached to a contracting organization she'd seen referenced in 2 of her 14-month reports, without understanding its significance at the time. A logistics company with embedded intelligence contracts, the kind of entity that existed in the space between military infrastructure and private interest, too useful to be scrutinized too hard, too connected to be questioned from below. Nora had flagged an anomalous contract reference in her 3rd report. Nobody had followed up. I flagged that name, she said. Marsh looked at her. I know. 14 months ago. I know. Marsh set the tablet down. Your reports were received. They were rerouted through Frey's oversight channel and buried. He was the one processing operational anomaly flags for this sector. The specific quality of this information, not the fact of the betrayal, which she'd already worked out, but the mechanism of it, the exact point where her work had been intercepted and dissolved, moved through her in a way she didn't have a name for. Not anger. Anger was too simple. Something more structural than that. The particular feeling of understanding exactly how a thing had failed. He was the oversight, she said. Yes. He was reviewing the reports filed about his own operation. Yes. She looked at the display, at the red marker on the Ravenspine corridor, at the extraction route she'd walked in the dark with 3 men's weight redistributed across her body and a dog tracking the ground ahead of her, and the specific calculation running constantly in the back of her mind. If Falk's seal fails, if Varro's tourniquet migrates, if Obika's shoulder bleeds out through the field dressing and into the joint capsule, a cascade she'd been managing and anticipating and staying one step ahead of for 14 hours. How long until the case is processed, she said. Preliminary read, 2 hours, Watts said. She nodded. She was going to stay upright for 2 more hours. After that, she'd negotiate with her body about what happened next. The case took 90 minutes. She knew when it was done because the energy in the operations room changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way that rooms changed when the information in them reached a threshold. The technical officer came in with a tablet, spoke to Voss quietly, and handed it over. Voss read it with the expression of a man who had suspected the scale of something and was now confronting the confirmation that his suspicion had been conservative. 14 months, he said. Yes, sir, the technical officer said. How many operations? At minimum, 7 confirmed compromised, likely more once we cross-reference with incident records. Casualties attributable? It wasn't a question, but the technical officer answered it anyway. A number. Not large by the standards of the conflict, but not small either. Each one a person who had walked into a mission that someone had rearranged around them without their knowledge. The ground made dangerous in ways they couldn't see and hadn't been warned about. Nora heard the number and did not look at the display. Voss put the tablet down. He stood very still for a moment in the specific way of a person who is deciding what to do with something enormous before it becomes the next action item. Then he looked at Marsh. Trent? He said, still in the security review room. Bring him here. Trent came in 3 minutes later, and the moment he entered the operations room and read the configuration of it, Voss at the center, Marsh to his left, the wall display behind them, the technical officer with the tablet, Nora standing to the right with a dog at her heel. The certainty on his face began its rearrangement. He had walked in expecting to be given authority. He looked at the display, at Frey's name, which had been added to it in the time since he'd been summoned, at the case notation in the corner. His mouth opened. Sir, he started. Captain Trent, Voss said, your formal complaint against Sergeant Vass has been reviewed. Sir, the security concern is still... The security concern, Voss said, has been attributed. He let that land. The route modification that compromised Strike Team 7 was made by Dalton Frey using administrative access he should not have had to mission planning systems. Frey is in custody. His data assembly is in evidence. A pause. Your complaint characterized Sergeant Vass as an unauthorized actor interfering with a secure operation. Your complaint was filed at 0219. Frey's access logs show headquarters system activity at 0204. Trent was very still. You filed a complaint neutralizing the one person on this base who had flagged the anomaly, Voss said, 15 minutes after the person responsible for that anomaly was active in the system she'd identified. I didn't know. What you knew or didn't know about Frey's operation is a separate question. Voss's voice stayed even in the way that was more effective than volume. What you knew about Sergeant Vass is not. She returned from a 14-hour extraction with 3 living casualties and a mission data drive that broke this open. You had her confined and filed charges. Trent looked at her. She looked back. She didn't have an expression prepared for this moment. What she had was tiredness and a shoulder that had been aching for 2 hours, and the specific clarity of someone who had already moved past needing anything from the person in front of her. Trent stopped. I judged the situation incorrectly. Yes, Voss said. You did. The room held its silence. Then one of the officers Nora didn't recognize cleared his throat. He was looking at his own tablet with the particular expression of someone who has just received information that changes the weight of the room considerably. "Sir," he said, "the case secondary documentation. There's a communication thread between Frey and an outside contact, dated 4 days ago." He looked up. It references Strike Team 7's mission by designation and requests confirmation of the modified route. 4 days ago, Voss said. "Yes, sir." "The mission brief was 5 days ago." "Yes, sir." The room was very quiet. Nora heard what that meant before anyone said it out loud. The modification had been planned before the final brief. The route was changed in the system at 2347, but the order to change it had existed 4 days earlier, which meant the ambush site had been selected, resourced, and positioned before Strike Team 7's mission. Parameters were even finalized. Someone on the outside had known not just the route, but the mission itself, had known it with enough lead time to build and place an ambush that was waiting when the team arrived. The inside access went deeper than Frey. Voss looked at Marsh. Marsh was already on her radio. And then the door at the back of the operations room opened, and the technical officer who'd processed the case came back in with an expression that had lost its professional neutrality entirely, and he walked directly to Voss and said something in a voice too low for Nora to hear from where she was standing. Voss looked at him for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Nora. "Your name," he said carefully, "appears in the secondary documentation." She waited. "Not as a target," he said, "as a person of interest flagged for neutralization." He paused. "The flag was placed 14 months ago, the same week your first anomaly report was filed." She heard it, processed it, set it in the right place. For 14 months, someone had known she was watching, and had been watching her back. Ash pressed against her leg. She looked down at him. His ears were fully up, pointed at the door she'd come in through, and his body had taken on the low, dense stillness that she had never in 2 years seen him apply to a situation that turned out to be nothing. She turned. The door was still closed, but through the small, reinforced window set into it, a figure had stopped moving in the corridor outside. And when Nora's eyes met theirs through the glass, the figure stepped back out of the frame. She'd seen that face before. Not here. Not at Coldwater. 3 months ago. In a pre-deployment staging area 200 miles south, during a mission planning review she'd been temporarily attached to. A civilian logistics consultant who'd sat in the back of 2 briefings and said nothing, and whom she'd noticed because he'd looked at the terrain maps with the specific attention of someone who was memorizing rather than reviewing. She looked at Voss. "Someone just walked past that door," she said. "Check your access log for the last 4 minutes." Watts was already moving. The technical officer pulled up the building access system on his tablet, and the color of his expression changed in the way that happened when a screen showed you something you hadn't expected and weren't ready to explain. "Sir," he said, "there's a badge entry logged 40 seconds ago. Clearance code is valid." He looked up. "It's listed as belonging to Colonel Marsh." Everyone turned. Marsh was standing in the room. She had been in the room for the last 20 minutes. She looked at the technical officer, then at Voss, then at Nora, with an expression that was, for the first time since Nora had met her, not controlled. "My badge," Marsh said. "Someone has my badge." "Lock the building," Voss said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The 2 words landed in the room with the specific weight of an order that had already calculated consequences and found them acceptable. And Watts had his radio up before the second word was finished. The lockdown tone sounded through headquarters. Not an alarm, just a low, sustained signal that meant all external doors sealed and all internal movement required authorization. Nora had heard it twice before in her career. Both times it had meant someone was somewhere they shouldn't be, and the building had become a net. Marsh was checking her jacket pockets with controlled urgency, working through them methodically, even though her face already knew what she was going to find. "It was in the operations room," she said. "I set my jacket on the chair when I came in at 07:20. "For how long?" Watts said. 20 minutes? Maybe 25. She looked up. "The jacket was there when I came back from the vehicle with Voss." 25 minutes was enough. More than enough. Someone had walked in, lifted the badge from an unattended jacket in a room that was in controlled access during a senior officer's arrival briefing, and walked back out through a corridor that had been appropriately busy for 0720 on a base that was already elevated. Nora was looking at the door. "The person I saw," she said. "Male. Mid-40s, civilian frame, not base build, dark jacket. He wasn't moving like someone who worked here." "You've seen him before," Voss said. It wasn't a question. He'd been watching her face when she'd turned. "Staging area, southern deployment point, about 3 months ago. He was in 2 mission planning briefings, listed as a logistics consultant on the attendee sheet." "Name?" "I don't know it. I noticed him because he was reading terrain maps like he was going to need to find something on them later." Voss looked at Watts. Watts was already pulling the staging area records on his tablet, which was either impressive efficiency or he'd already anticipated needing them, and she wasn't sure which. Ash moved to the door. Not dramatically, just repositioned, the way he did when a situation's geography had shifted and he was updating his orientation to it. He was facing the interior corridor now, the direction the figure had gone after stepping back from the window. "He went deeper in," Nora said, "not toward an exit." The room registered this. "What's in the interior of this building?" Marsh said. "Record storage," Watt said. "Server room?" "The mission archive." A pause. "Communications relay." Nora looked at Voss. "If he can access the communications relay, he can signal out," Voss finished. "Or he can wipe it," Marsh said quietly. "If there's anything in the relay logs that ties the external contractor to the operation, a targeted deletion before we reach it." "Go," Voss said. To Watts, to security, to everyone. And then he looked at Nora, and something in his face made a decision that bypassed protocol in the way that senior officers occasionally did when the situation had exceeded the speed of procedure. "Take the dog." She was already moving. The interior corridor of headquarters was longer than it looked from the operations room. A central spine with branching access points, each one requiring badge clearance that was now locked out under the building seal, which meant whoever was inside had 2 options: wait out the lockdown in a space with a reader they could spoof, or move fast toward a target before the lockdown secondary sweep reached them. Ash was working ahead of her, not sprinting, quartering the corridor in tight arcs with his nose low and his tail flat. She read him the way she read a patient's vitals, continuous, adaptive, inferring the picture from the data stream. He was tracking something that had moved recently and was still moving. The scent trail was fresh enough that his arcs were shortening, narrowing, converging on a direction. Server room. Left branch, 40 meters. She signaled Watts behind her with 2 fingers. He acknowledged. The server room door was closed. Badge reader active. The lockdown should have frozen it, but the reader's indicator light was cycling in the irregular pattern that meant it had been manually overridden. Not hacked, overridden, which required physical access and a secondary key that wasn't standard issue. "He had access before he got here," she said. "Planning," Watts said behind her. "This wasn't improvised." She looked at the reader. "He came here specifically. He knew what he needed to reach." Ash sat down at the door. Sat, not lay. The distinction mattered. Sit was the indicator for a target that was stationary on the other side. Lay was distance. Sit meant close. She looked at Watts. He had 2 security officers with him. He pointed left, pointed right. They positioned. She knocked on the door. 3 times. Evenly spaced. Silence. Then, "It's not what you think it is." The voice came through the door, muffled but audible, educated, calibrated. The voice of someone who had spent time in rooms deciding what other people were worth. "Open the door," she said. A pause. "I'm doing something that needs to be finished." "You're deleting records." "I'm protecting an infrastructure that—" "Open the door." Another silence. Longer. She heard movement inside, but not fleeing, not the sounds of someone trying to get away from a door, but the specific, focused sounds of someone finishing something. Keyboard. Movement. Keyboard. She looked at Watts, he looked at the door. She stepped back and let the security officers do what security officers did, which was faster and more final than negotiation. The door came open in 8 seconds. The man inside was standing at a server terminal with his hands raised, which suggested he'd heard them coming and decided the posture was better than the alternative. He was exactly who she'd thought, the face from the staging area briefings, 3 months ago, the one that had memorized terrain maps. Up close, he had the look of someone who operated in the space between official and unofficial, comfortable in both, native to neither. The terminal screen behind him showed a deletion prompt, 73% complete. "Stop it," Watts said to the technical officer who'd followed them in. The technical officer moved to the terminal and killed the process. 73%. Not complete. 27% of whatever had been targeted was still intact. The man with his hands up looked at the screen and then looked away. "Sit down," Nora said. He sat. She looked at the terminal. The deletion log showed 14 targeted files across 3 directories. Communications Relay Archives, specifically the external routing logs for outbound encrypted signals from the base's administrative channels. Someone had used those channels to move information out of Coldwater for months, and someone had arranged for those logs to disappear before they could be cross-referenced with Frey's case data. 27% had survived. "What's your name?" she said. He looked at her. "You wouldn't know it." "Tell me anyway." A pause. "Renner," he said. "Jeff Renner. I'm a logistics consultant embedded with—" "I know what your title says," she said. "I sat in 2 briefings with you at a southern staging area in February. You were reviewing terrain overlays for a corridor that wasn't part of any active mission at that time." She watched his face. "At the time I thought it was standard planning forward. Now I'm revising that." Renner looked at her with the particular expression of someone reassessing what they'd underestimated. "You have a very specific memory." "It's a problem I've had my whole career," she said. Watts moved in with flex cuffs, and Renner didn't resist, which told her he'd already moved past the phase of the situation where resistance was part of his calculation. He was in the next phase, the one where you waited and measured and found what remained to work with. "The deletion," he said as Watts secured him. "You stopped it at 73%. "Yes," Watts said. "The 27% that survived—" He paused. "You won't like it." The room was quiet. "Why?" Nora said. He looked at her. "Because it includes routing logs from before I was here," he said. "Before Frey. Before this operation." "How far before?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. Watts looked at the technical officer, who was already working through the surviving file archive with the focused speed of someone who understood that what he was reading was going to change the shape of the investigation they were currently inside. The technical officer stopped moving. He read something twice. Then he turned around with the expression Nora had come to associate with the moment a situation exceeded its own expected scope. "Sir," he said to Watts, "the earliest routing log in the surviving archive. It's dated 22 months ago." He paused. "The destination address for the outbound signal. It resolves to a classified communication node that's registered to a joint oversight committee." Watts was very still. "Which committee?" he said. The technical officer said the name. Watts closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Nora looked at Renner. Renner was looking at the floor. 22 months, she said. "This started before Frey was placed here." "Frey was placed here because of it," Renner said. Quiet. Flat. The voice of someone who had decided that the calculation had shifted far enough that withholding was no longer useful. The Oversight Committee's logistics arm needed someone with internal access to manage the operational side. Frey was recruited. I handled external coordination. "The contract company," Nora said. "The one Marsh named." "A vehicle," he said. "Shell over shell. The actual principles are—" He stopped. "Are what?" "Are people who attend the same oversight briefings that authorized your unit's deployment to this sector," he said. "People who reviewed your mission parameters and then routed them outward to parties with commercial interests in the corridor you were operating in." The silence in the server room was different from other silences. It was the silence of a dimension expanding, the investigation they thought they were inside turning out to be the visible portion of something considerably larger. "Say that plainly," Watts said. Someone on the Joint Oversight Committee has been selling operational data to private interests for almost 2 years, Renner said. Mission routes, team designations, corridor access windows. The ambush on Ravenspine wasn't an isolated purchase. It was the latest in a series. He looked up. The series includes 6 previous operations. I can tell you which ones. Watts put a hand on his radio. Don't use base comms, Nora said. He looked at her. If the routing logs show outbound signals from the base's administrative channels, she said, we don't know which channels are still compromised. Don't use anything internal. Watts took his hand off the radio. He pulled out a personal device instead and looked at it for a moment. The specific look of someone recalculating who was safe to call and finding the list shorter than expected. He called Voss directly. The next 90 minutes moved in the way that consequential things moved. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the dense forward momentum of a process that had passed the point where any individual could redirect it. Voss arrived in the server room within 4 minutes of Watts's call. He read the surviving archive himself, standing at the terminal, and didn't speak for the duration of it. When he finished reading, he stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. 22 months, he said. Yes, sir, the technical officer said. Voss looked at Renner. Renner met the look with the contained expression of someone who had decided that cooperation was now the superior strategy and was executing it accordingly. I want names, Voss said. Committee level, not the shells. Renner looked at the ceiling. Not evasion. The gesture of someone doing arithmetic. I'll give you names, he said. I want something in writing first. You're not in a position to negotiate. I'm in the only position that has information you can't get from the drive or Frey, Renner said, not aggressively. Frey knew his side of the operation. I knew the architecture. Those are different things. He looked at Voss. I want it in writing. Voss looked at Marsh, who had appeared in the server room doorway at some point in the last 10 minutes, and was listening with the expression of a person assembling pieces rapidly. Get the JAG officer, he said. Marsh stepped out. Nora looked at Renner. He looked back at her, not hostilely, not contritely, with a kind of measuring attention. You were flagged 14 months ago, he said. Your anomaly reports. I know. The flag was assessed as low priority. The assessment was wrong. He paused. The person who assessed it didn't expect you to be persistent. I wasn't being persistent, she said. I was doing my job. He seemed to find this either naive or correct, and couldn't decide which. She didn't particularly care which he landed on. Trent was in the operations room when they came back through. He had not been asked to leave and had not left of his own accord, which told her something she filed without comment. He was standing near the back wall with the contained, careful posture of a man who understood that the room had restructured around him and was waiting to understand what his position in the new structure was. The wall display behind him had been updated. Additional markers on the Ravenspine corridor, a network diagram that hadn't been there an hour ago, names in boxes connected by lines that represented the shape of what the surviving archive had revealed. He looked at it, and she watched him understand what he was looking at. Not because he had been part of it. She was no longer certain he had been. The timeline and access logs had not put him in the network. And Renner, who was now talking with the JAG officer in the adjacent room, had not named him. Trent had been a problem, a liability, a man who had seen something he didn't understand and had reacted to it with the particular aggressive certainty of someone who was always most dangerous when he was most wrong. But that was different from conspiracy. He was looking at the display and understanding, visibly, the scale of what had been moving around him while he'd been filing complaints and enforcing procedure and calling for restraints on a woman who'd carried 3 men down a mountain. He turned when she came in. He looked at her for a long moment. The certainty was gone from his face, not replaced by anything clean like remorse, but by the complicated expression of someone who had been wrong in a large way and was working out what to do with that. The charges, he said. Have been withdrawn, Watts said from behind her. Voss signed off at 0917. Trent looked at her. I owe you. He stopped. I handled it wrong. You did, she said. He seemed to expect more than that. She didn't have more for him. She wasn't angry at him, exactly. which was a strange thing to discover about herself at 09:20 after 20-plus hours without real sleep. She was something flatter than angry, tired of the specific pattern of it, of being looked at by men like Trent and found insufficient, not because she'd given them reason to, but because the looking had been lazy and the conclusion had been preformed. She dealt with the consequences of it, and the consequences were resolved, and she didn't have the energy left to perform the conversation he was looking for. "I judged appearances," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." And she moved past him. Voss caught her near the door, not physically. He said her name, the way people said names when they meant, "Wait, I have something that matters." She turned. "Dagon's family," he said. "They've been notified. Official channel." He paused. "The information about the route manipulation, what it means for how he died, that's going to take time to reach them through proper procedure." "I know. There's a letter that should come from someone who was there." He didn't tell her what to do. He was the kind of officer who knew the difference between an order and a request and was making the latter. She thought about Dagon's face. She'd only seen it for 4 minutes, the 2 before the contact and the 2 after, the ones she'd used to confirm what she already knew and then close his eyes. He'd had the photo. She'd seen it when she'd checked him, a small print tucked in the left breast pocket. Newborn, from the size of it, the small creased edges of something carried a long time. "I'll write it," she said. Voss nodded. Now, the investigation moved fast after that, in the way things moved when they'd accumulated enough mass that they carried their own momentum. Renner's testimony, delivered in a formal recorded session with the JAG officer and 2 investigators who arrived from an external command by helicopter at 1400, produced 6 names. 4 of them were in committee positions. 2 were in contracting roles that bridged the committee's logistics arm to the private interests that had been purchasing operational data for 22 months. The committee had not known it was being used, Renner said. Not entirely. Certain members had known, others had been managed around. The ones who had known had done so for reasons that were, he was careful with this word, strategic. The data sales had funded operations that didn't appear in any official budget line, channeled through the contract company into activities that the purchasers considered stabilizing and the sold soldiers would have considered a sentence. Federal investigators arrived at 1600. Nora watched them come through the main gate from the window of the billet room, where she had finally sat down with Ash at her feet and a cup of something hot that was either tea or coffee, depending on which bin the base kitchen had reached first. She wasn't sure how long she'd been sitting there. Her body had stopped complaining, which meant it had gone past complaining into the quieter register of serious need. Her phone, returned to her with her confiscated equipment at 1100, showed 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, and 2 from Obika, who was apparently ambulatory and looking for someone to debrief with. She'd call him back. Not yet. The drive was in federal evidence now. Frey was in federal custody, transported off base at 12:30 in a vehicle that left without ceremony through the main gate. Trent had formally retracted his charges in writing, which was the procedural outcome, and had given a statement to investigators that was, by all accounts, straightforwardly honest about what he'd seen and done and why. She'd heard this from Watts secondhand and believed it. Trent was a man who'd been wrong badly enough to crack the certainty he'd built his career on, and that kind of cracking could go 2 ways. It seemed, in his case, to be going toward honesty. She didn't know if that would hold. It wasn't her concern. What was her concern was in the room down the hallway. Varro had been moved from the surgical ward to a recovery room at 1100, and he was awake, which she'd confirmed from Harwick at 11:15. Falk was still in the extended post-op monitoring phase. The lung was holding, the chest cavity was stable. The long recovery Harwick had promised was underway. Obika had been discharged from medical assessment at 0800 with a sling and a list of restrictions he was clearly ignoring. She stood up. Ash looked at her. "Come on," she said. "Doug." The recovery room had 2 beds, and Varro was in the far one with his leg elevated and a tablet propped on his chest that he appeared to be using to argue with someone over a sports result from 3 days ago. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of a person calculating what they owe and finding the number too large for a normal transaction. You look terrible, he said. You look like you have a leg, she said. He glanced down at it. Harwick says 6 weeks before full weight bearing. He's being optimistic, probably 8. Vero absorbed this. You would know. I would know. He set the tablet down. Ash moved to the side of the bed and sat, and Vero reached down and put his hand on the dog's head with the careful gesture of someone who had heard about Ash but wasn't quite sure about the protocol. Ash permitted it, which was its own form of evaluation passed. What happened with Trent? Vero said. He backed off, and the ambush. That's going to take longer to explain. Vero looked at her. He had the face of a person who had been lying in a bed for hours with nothing to do except reconstruct events from fragments, and had constructed a version that was probably incomplete. Is it bad? It's bad enough, she said. He nodded slowly. He seemed to understand that some things needed to settle before they could be fully seen. Falk's going to be okay, he said. I know. You knew in the field, didn't you? It wasn't a question exactly. When you did he gestured vaguely at his own chest, the needle thing, you knew it would hold. She thought about the dark and the sound the seal had made and the specific quality of Falk's next breath, and about the calculation she'd been running for the following 13 hours. I knew it wasn't going to fail immediately, she said. The rest was management. That's not the same as knowing. No, she agreed, it isn't. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. Direct, without preamble. The way people said things when they decided the full weight of what they meant to say and committed to it. She nodded. She left before the moment could become something either of them had to manage. Harwick found her in the corridor outside. He had the expression of a man who had something to say and had been waiting for the right moment and had decided the right moment was now. Federal team wants your formal medical testimony, he said. Timeline, interventions, everything from field contact to gate arrival. When? Tomorrow morning. They're setting up a deposition environment in the operations building. He paused. I already gave mine. I told them the field decompression and the extraction protocol were executed at a standard that most personnel in a controlled environment would have struggled with. He looked at her steadily. I also told them that the anomaly reports you filed were substantively accurate and should have triggered a review 14 months ago. She hadn't expected that. Did they ask about the reports? I volunteered it. He paused. Someone should have, earlier. She looked at him. He had the expression of a person who had been in an institution long enough to understand where it failed and had decided, at some point, that understanding it wasn't sufficient. Thank you, she said. Get some sleep, he said. Depositions at 0900. He walked away. She stood in the corridor for a moment, with Ash beside her, and the building humming around her with the specific energy of a place that had been turned inside out and was in the process of understanding its own contents. She was going toward the billet room when her phone buzzed. The number was the unrecognized one that had called 3 times before. She looked at it. Then she answered. Sergeant Vass? The voice was unfamiliar, male, deliberate. The kind of voice that chose its words the way someone chose a tool, specifically for the job it needed to do. You don't know me. My name isn't relevant right now. What's relevant is that I know what you recovered from the server room this morning. She stopped walking. The 27%, the voice said. You think that's what survived. Her chest tightened slightly, in the way it tightened when she processed a piece of information that changed the geometry of what she'd understood. It isn't, she said. The deletion prompt you saw on the screen, the voice said. 73% complete. That was what he wanted you to see. Renner was sophisticated enough to understand that a completed deletion triggers recovery protocols. An interrupted deletion at 73% triggers sympathy. A pause. The files in your surviving 27% are real. They're also the files Renner was comfortable losing. Ash was completely still at her feet. What's in the other 73%, she said. Things that would make 6 names look like a short list, the voice said. And a communication that was routed 14 months ago, the week you filed your first report, to an address inside Voss's command structure. She held the phone against her ear and did not move. "The general," the voice said, "is not who you think he is." She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds without moving. That was the amount of time it took to run through the possible categories of what this call was. Misinformation, a test, a manipulation, someone's attempt to fracture the investigation by seeding doubt about the one authority figure who had moved correctly since the moment he'd landed, and to arrive at the uncomfortable position of not being able to dismiss any of them. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who's been watching this operation from outside it for 8 months, the voice said. "I'm not on any roster you'd find. I'm not connected to Frey or Renner or the committee. My interest is in what happens to the 73%. "Where is it?" Backed up to an external node before Renner walked into that server room. He staged the interrupted deletion. The real archive moved 40 minutes before he used Marsh's badge. A pause. "He knew the lockdown was coming. He'd been watching your morning." She processed this. "How did he know?" "Because someone on base was feeding him a position feed," the voice said. "Not Trent. Not anyone you've looked at yet. A passive access, a monitoring protocol embedded in the base communication system 14 months ago. He knew where you were from the moment you reached Coldwater Gate." She thought about the first hours, about Trent appearing at the gate, about the timing of the security review request, about Frey's activity in the headquarters system at 0204, 15 minutes before Trent's complaint. She'd thought the 15 minutes was coincidence or parallel action. It hadn't been. Someone had been watching her location in real time and coordinating responses to it. "The archive," she said. "Where is it?" "Secure. External. Not reachable by anyone currently inside Coldwater or connected to the federal team that arrived at 1600. "Why are you telling me this?" A longer pause. The kind that meant the answer was true, and the person giving it was deciding whether true was the right choice. "Because the address inside Voss's command structure," the voice said. "I've been sitting on it for 8 months trying to understand if it means what it looks like it means. And I can't determine that without someone who is in the operational environment and can corroborate the timeline." "You want me to corroborate?" "I want you to look at what I have and tell me if the timeline matches what you saw in the field." She looked at Ash. He was watching the corridor behind her, not alerting, just watching, the way he watched things that were present but not yet resolved. "If Voss is part of this," she said, "I walked into his operations room this morning and handed him everything." "Yes," the voice said. "The federal team. He called them." "He called a federal contact," the voice said. "The team that arrived. Check who authorized their deployment orders." She felt the specific, nauseating geometry of a situation that had been larger than she'd understood from inside it. The shape of a room whose walls were further back than the light showed. "What do you need from me?" she said. "Meet me. Off base. Tonight." He gave her a location. A specific road junction, 7 kilometers from Coldwater's perimeter, with a detail she could verify. A fuel depot on the southeast corner with a yellow gate that was padlocked at night. She knew the junction. She'd passed it on the convoy route in. "If I leave base right now," she said, "I'm walking out of a federal investigation." "You're walking out of a federal investigation that may be pointed in the wrong direction," the voice said. "Your choice." He ended the call. She stood in the corridor for 30 more seconds, which was how long it took to make a decision she'd been moving toward since the moment she'd asked Trent about the route change and watched his face do the wrong thing, since she'd filed the first report 14 months ago and waited for something to come back and nothing had, since she'd carried 3 men down a mountain and arrived at a gate and been told she was the problem. She thought about Voss, about the way he'd looked at Dagon's name on the display, the 2-second stillness of a man confronting a death, about the way he'd said, "Take the dog," which was not the instruction of a man trying to control an investigation, but of a man trying to solve one. About the letter he'd asked her to write for Dagon's family, which was not the move of someone managing appearances, but of someone who understood what was owed. It could all be performance. She knew that. She'd been doing this long enough to know that the most effective deceits wore the face of integrity. But she also knew something else. The voice on the phone had told her Renner had been monitoring her position feed since she arrived at the gate. If that was true, it was verifiable. If it was verifiable, It either confirmed or broke everything else the voice had said, and she could verify it in 20 minutes without leaving the base. She went to find Harwick. Harwick's office was dark except for the desk lamp. He looked up when she came in and read her face with the diagnostic speed of a man who spent his career reading faces for information they weren't trying to give. "Sit down," he said. "I need something from the base communications log," she said. "Specifically, I need to know if there's a monitoring protocol embedded in the communication system that would produce a real-time position feed for base personnel." He looked at her. "That's a technical systems question." "You've been on this base for 4 years," she said. "Do you know the signal's warrant officer?" He did. He called, without asking why, and she appreciated that more than she could say in the moment. The warrant officer, a woman named Sergeant Paz, who sounded like she'd been asleep and was now very much not, took 8 minutes to run the query and came back with an answer that settled into Nora's chest like something cold, a passive monitoring protocol. Embedded 14 months ago. Logging the communication device positions of all personnel carrying base-registered equipment within Coldwater's perimeter. Not a standard base tracking system. The base's own IT administration didn't have it in their authorized software manifest. It had been piggybacking on the base network for 14 months, sending periodic location pings to an external server address. "Get Watts," Nora said. Harwick was already picking up his phone. She gave Watts 20 minutes. In those 20 minutes, she went to the billet room, gave Ash water, ate the rest of the food in her bag that she'd been rationing by not thinking about it, and looked at the phone with the unrecognized number. She typed a message. "The monitoring protocol is confirmed. I need to see the archive. Coordinates in 40 minutes. The response came in under a minute. Yellowgate, 2100. It was 1940. Watts arrived at the billet block at 1943 with the expression of a man who had run out of capacity for new information and was accepting it anyway because stopping wasn't an option. She told him about the call, about the monitoring protocol, which Paz had already escalated to him in parallel, about the external archive and the claim about Voss's command structure. He listened without interrupting. "The federal team," she said, "who authorized their deployment." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his tablet. He was quiet for a specific kind of time, the time it took to find something and confirm it and decide what to do with the confirmation. "The deployment order," he said. "It went through Voss's command office. Not directly federal authorization. Voss's office contacted federal and requested the team," Watts said, "which is normal procedure when a base-level investigation exceeds internal capacity." A pause. "The specific agents who were sent, the selection came from a federal contact that Voss has had for—" He stopped. He set the tablet down. "How long?" she said. 12 years, he said. "They served together." The room was quiet. "I'm not saying he's involved," Watts said. "What I'm saying is that the chain isn't as clean as I thought it was this morning." "I need to go off base," she said. "Nora, I know what I'm asking." She looked at him directly. "Someone has a full archive of 22 months of operational data that includes a communication trail reaching into Voss's structure. If that archive gets lost or suppressed or handed to the wrong people, what happened on Ravenspine doesn't get fully answered. Dagon doesn't get fully answered." She paused. "I need to go look at it." Watts was quiet for a long time. "If you leave base during an active federal investigation," he said, "I can't protect you from the procedural consequences of that." "I know. I also can't stop you," he said. "You're not in confinement anymore." "No," she said, "I'm not." He looked at her with the expression of a man making a decision that he would need to be able to defend later and was choosing to make it anyway. "Take your phone," he said. "Check in every 30 minutes. If I don't hear from you in 45, I'm sending people to those coordinates." "Agreed," she said. He gave her a vehicle. "Yeah." The road junction was exactly as described. A Y intersection 7 kilometers out, the fuel depot on the southeast corner with a yellow gate padlocked in the evening quiet, a gravel shoulder wide enough for 2 vehicles. She arrived at 2057 and parked and sat for 3 minutes with the engine off, reading the environment the way she'd read every environment for the last 20-plus hours. Ash was in the back seat, nose to the window crack, tail still. A vehicle was already there. Gray. Older model. A man got out when she pulled up, not the rushing movement of someone nervous, but the deliberate movement of someone who had been sitting in a car for a while and was relieved to stop. He was in his late 40s, civilian clothes, the kind of build that had once been military and had settled into something that retained the posture without the mass. He had a laptop bag over one shoulder and the expression of someone who had been carrying something heavy for 8 months and was now, possibly, putting it down. "Vas," he said. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "Ellerman," he said. "I was an analyst with the Joint Oversight Committee's Internal Review Division for 3 years. I was running a quiet audit on the logistics arms contract expenditures when I found the first outbound routing signal 8 months ago." He paused. "I'm not with the committee anymore. I resigned 4 months ago when I understood that reporting internally was going to make the audit disappear and me with it." "And you've been sitting on this for 4 months. "I've been trying to understand the scope before I brought it somewhere," he said, "because the scope determines where it goes. Take it to the wrong place, and it becomes a different kind of problem." "The address in Voss's command structure," she said. "Show me." He opened the laptop. The communication was dated 14 months ago, sent from the external server that hosted the monitoring protocol to an internal address inside the Joint Command Oversight Office. The address was registered to a deputy coordinator, a civilian role, not military, named Harlan Price. Ellerman pulled up the role description. Deputy Coordinator for Operational Resource Allocation, Joint Oversight Committee, Sector West. "Voss's command structure," she said. "Price reports to the committee, not to Voss directly," Ellerman said, "but his role interfaces with Voss's Operational Planning Office on resource allocation. He had access to deployment orders, mission parameters, and regional operational calendars. He's not military. Civilian embed. The committee places them in command structures across all regional operations. They're supposed to be administrative. In practice, they have access to almost everything that crosses a commanding general's desk." He scrolled. Price received the monitoring protocol's initial setup confirmation and responded to it, not forwarding it, not flagging it, responding with an access credential that gave the external server read permission on the location feed. She read the response. It was 4 words and an authorization code. Confirmed. Proceed as planned. "Where is Price now?" she said. "Washington," Ellerman said. "He rotated out of Sector West 8 months ago. He's currently attached to a different regional command oversight." He looked at her. "He's been in that role for 2 weeks. She thought about what that meant. A man who had helped build the monitoring infrastructure, who had confirmed the location tracking of base personnel, who had then rotated out before the investigation that was now dismantling the network he'd helped construct, rotating not away from oversight but into a new one, taking whatever he knew about the operational pattern with him, starting the geometry again somewhere else. "This goes to the federal team," she said. "Which federal team?" Ellerman said. It wasn't cynical. It was the question of someone who had spent 8 months learning to ask it. She looked at the laptop, at the routing logs, at 22 months of signals that had moved through the base's own infrastructure, carrying operational data to people who had sold it and used it and built a structure on top of it that looked, from the outside, like normal institutional complexity. "Not the ones Voss called," she said. "No," Ellerman agreed. "Not those ones." She picked up her phone and called Watts. Heck, what happened next took time and was not clean. None of it was clean. She'd stopped expecting clean sometime around hour 4 of the Ravenspine extraction, when she'd been packing a wound in the dark and calculating the probability distributions of outcomes she couldn't control, and had arrived at the understanding that the job wasn't to make things clean. It was to make them survivable and then, when possible, true. Watts made calls she didn't make. He had contacts she didn't have access to. People in the federal structure who were genuinely external to Voss's network, reachable through channels that didn't pass through the command structure that Price had sat inside. It took 90 minutes and 2 intermediate contacts, and the result was an investigative authority that arrived at Coldwater the next morning in vehicles with no base authorization markings, carrying credentials that superseded the first federal team's jurisdiction. The first federal team was placed on administrative hold while their deployment authorization was audited. Two of its three senior agents were cleared within 48 hours. One was not. Ellerman handed over the full archive. She handed over everything she had, including the written record of every report she'd filed over 14 months, which she'd kept in a personal encrypted file on a device that had never been registered to any base system and therefore had never appeared in the monitoring protocol's location feed. She'd started keeping the personal record after her third report went unanswered. She'd thought at the time that she was probably being paranoid. She had not been paranoid enough. Long. The hearings began 11 days after Ravenspine. They were not public in the way that news was public, but they were not sealed either. A formal congressional oversight inquiry, convened by a subcommittee that had jurisdiction over joint command operations, with testimony recorded and entered into the official record. She testified on the fourth day, in a room that was smaller than she'd expected and more crowded with serious-faced people than she'd prepared herself for. She was not good at serious rooms full of people looking at her. She was good at the content of what she had to say, which was specific and documented and time-stamped and corroborated by Ellerman's archive, by Gresse and Obika's field statements, by Harwick's medical testimony, and by a technical analysis of the monitoring protocol that traced its installation to a specific date and a specific access credential. The access credential belonged to Dalton Frey. Frey gave full testimony in exchange for a negotiated arrangement that reduced his exposure in ways she found imperfect and necessary in equal measure. That was the part of the institutional process that she had to make peace with, the trading and the negotiation, the way the machine processed culpability by volume and hierarchy and cooperation, rather than by the clean arithmetic of what had been done and to whom. Dagan was dead. 6 other operations had been compromised over 22 months. The people who'd bought the data had made money on corridor access and resource contracts that were now frozen and under audit. Frey got a reduced charge and a decade of restrictions. Renner, who had staged the deletion and run the external coordination, received the full weight of what the committee of 7 serious-faced people decided to apply to him. It was not a small weight. Harlan Price was arrested at his new posting 11 days after Ellerman handed over the archive. He was escorted from the building by 2 agents who had been specifically not briefed through any channel that passed through his new command structure, which was a logistical complexity that Watts had spent 3 days arranging and which he described to her afterward with the particular satisfaction of a man who appreciated when the mechanism of a thing matched the scale of it. The contracting company, the shells over shells that Renner had described, was dismantled by a financial investigation that took 4 months and reached entities in 3 separate countries. She didn't follow all of it. She followed enough. Voss was cleared. That took longer than anything else and was the part she sat with the most uncomfortably, because the question of what he'd known and when had lived in her chest since the phone call at 1940, with a weight that the formal clearance didn't entirely remove. The investigation found no evidence of his involvement in the network, no evidence of communication with Price beyond the normal administrative interface of their overlapping roles, no evidence that he had understood what Price was doing with the access he had to the command structure's operational calendar. What it found was that he had trusted a civilian in bed who had been there before him, who had been vetted by the committee that placed him, who had produced 3 years of unremarkable administrative work before using the access it had given him. He had not been complicit. He had been used. She thought about the difference between those 2 things for a long time before she arrived somewhere she could put it down. He came to find her 2 weeks after the inquiry concluded. Not officially. He was on base for an operational review, and he walked to the training field on the base's east perimeter where she'd been working with Ash in the late afternoon, and he stood at the edge of the field and waited until she noticed him. She walked over. He looked different without the pressure of the morning she'd met him in. Still composed. Still the kind of man who wore authority like a second skeleton, but with something underneath the surface that acknowledged the weight of what the last 3 weeks had been. The inquiry's findings were formally filed this morning, he said. I know. Your record has been updated, the confinement, the charges, they've been removed and sealed. Your anomaly reports have been formally entered into the record as substantively accurate intelligence that was improperly suppressed. I know, she said again. He looked at her steadily. I want to say something that isn't procedural. She waited. Price was in my structure for 14 months before you filed your first report, he said. In that time, I reviewed his administrative output 47 times. I signed off on resource allocation documents that went through his desk. I had every reason to look more carefully, and I didn't. He paused. That's not the same as what Frey did. It's not the same as Renner, but it's not nothing either. She looked at him. At the careful honesty of it, which she believed, and which she also understood didn't change the mechanics of what had happened. He hadn't built the structure. He'd walked through it without examining the walls closely enough, and 6 operations had been compromised, and a lieutenant had died in a corridor that had been rearranged before he stepped into it. You're asking me something, she said. I'm not sure I'm entitled to ask you anything, he said. Say it anyway. He looked at the field, at Ash, who was sitting 20 meters away watching them with the alert interest of a dog who understood that a conversation was happening and had not yet determined if it was relevant to him. You could have taken what you found and gone in any direction with it, Voss said. You could have framed it in a way that was worse for me than the evidence supported. You didn't. The evidence was what it was, she said. That's not always enough to stop people from choosing how to use it. She thought about that, about the window she'd had to shape the narrative in ways that would have been simpler and more satisfying in some immediate sense, about the temptation of that, which she wasn't going to pretend she hadn't felt, about what she'd decided instead, which was that the truth was the truth, and its value was in its precision, not in what you could make it support. The point was never to punish everyone adjacent to the problem, she said. The point was to get it right. He looked at her. That takes longer, she added. It's less satisfying in the moment, but it's the only version that actually holds. He nodded, once. The nod of someone who had understood something they already intellectually knew but were hearing said plainly for the first time. Dagon's family, he said. The letter you sent. Yes. His sister contacted the inquiry coordinator. She asked if it was possible to pass along. He paused. She said it was the only thing she'd received since his death that told her who he was there, rather than what he was assigned to. He looked at her. I thought you should know. She did not look away, but it cost her something. He had a photo, she said, in his left breast pocket. A newborn. I don't know whose. His daughter, Voss said. Born 12 days before the mission. He hadn't met her yet. She absorbed this, set it where it needed to go, which was not away. She'd learned a long time ago that putting things away didn't mean they stopped taking up space. It meant she would carry them differently. That was the actual work, the part nobody acknowledged. Not the forgetting, but the figuring out how to keep moving with the weight distributed so it didn't stop you. There's a position, Voss said. It's not what your sealed record reflects in terms of your previous role. It's new. A field medical intelligence coordination role, specifically designed to close the gap between operational anomaly reporting and command-level response. The inquiry's final recommendations included it. He paused. It would mean your reports go somewhere with teeth. She looked at him. You don't have to decide now, he said. I know, she said. He left. She stood on the field with Ash and watched the late afternoon light move across the grass, and she thought about the word position and what it meant and what she felt about it, which was not the clean arc of a person who had been wronged and been vindicated and was now ready to step into the role the story seemed to be offering her. What she felt was more complicated than that. She was 32 years old and she had spent 14 months filing reports into what felt like empty space, and before that she'd spent years in operational environments where the gap between what was happening and what was being acknowledged was something she'd learned to operate inside of without being consumed by it. She was tired in a way that the last 3 weeks had not resolved. She was also, and this was the part she kept returning to, still here, still on this side of a situation that had been specifically designed to remove people who noticed too much. Dagon hadn't made it to the other side. 6 other operations had people who hadn't made it. She could take the tiredness and leave. She had enough documented and enough formally recognized now that leaving would be clean, would be justified, would be understood by anyone who knew the full shape of what she'd been through. Nobody who mattered would call it anything other than reasonable. Or she could take the tiredness and stay. Not because she owed it to anyone, exactly. She had learned to be skeptical of that framing, which had a way of being used to extract more from people than was fair and was sometimes true and often wasn't. But because the gap was real. The gap between what happened in the field and what was understood above it was real and had cost real people real things. And the fact that she was one of the few people who had operational experience on both sides of it, and the specific stubbornness to keep filing reports even when the reports went nowhere, that was not a coincidence she could dismiss by leaving. She sat down in the grass. Ash came over and put his head on her knee with the deliberate weight of a dog who had decided that this was where he was going to be for the duration. She put her hand on his head. She thought about Vero, who was 3 weeks into his recovery, and had sent her 2 messages. One about his leg and one about a sports result that she had responded to incorrectly and had been informed of this at length. She thought about Falk, who was breathing with both lungs and who had sent a photograph of himself standing, not weight-bearing, standing, leaning heavily on a support frame, grinning like a man who had been told he had months of hard recovery ahead of him and had decided to grin about it anyway. She thought about Obika, who had gone back to his unit and sent a single message that said, "We know what happened out there. All of us do. Don't let anyone tell you different." She thought about Trent. She hadn't spoken to him since the operations room. She'd heard from Watts that he'd given full and honest testimony to the inquiry, had formally requested that his complaint and the charges be struck from her record, and had subsequently applied for a transfer to a training role, a choice that suggested he understood what his presence in a command position now meant, and had made a decision about it that she hadn't expected and found she couldn't dismiss. People surprised her occasionally. She'd learned not to use that as a reason to trust them, but also not to let the surprise pass without noticing it. He'd been wrong, publicly and consequentially wrong. He was living with that now and would for a long time. That was not nothing. It was also not enough on its own. But it was somewhere. She looked at the field, at the late light, at the space between where she was sitting and the horizon, which was not a metaphor. It was just the actual horizon, grass and fence line and the darkening sky over the mountains that were the same mountains they always were. Indifferent and large, not hostile, just present. She made the decision she'd been making since the phone call the night before, the one she'd been circling around and testing and stress fracturing to see where it broke. It held. She would take the position, not because it was owed to her and not because she felt obligated by guilt or grief or the weight of other people's outcomes, because the work was real and she was good at it, and the reason it had gone wrong for 14 months was not that the reports were wrong or that the system was categorically broken beyond use. It was that the wrong people had been in the places where the reports landed. The new position changed that. Imperfectly, provisionally, in ways that would require constant maintenance and would probably still fail in some cases and would produce new frustrations she couldn't yet predict. That was the actual shape of things. Clean arcs were for stories that didn't have to keep being lived in after they ended. She stood up. Ash stood up. She took out her phone and sent Voss one word. Yes. Then she put the phone in her pocket and looked at the field and thought about Dagon's daughter, who was now 3 weeks old and did not know yet that her father had died carrying her photograph over his heart. Who would be told eventually, at an age when it would be possible to understand it, and would have to decide what to do with the weight of it? Who would grow up with the gap between what she knew and what had actually happened slowly filling in as the records were released and the inquiry's findings became history? Nora couldn't do anything about any of that. She couldn't undo the gap or fill it in or make the weight lighter. What she could do was make sure the next time a report was filed by anyone from any field position at any point in a chain that was supposed to be accountable, it didn't land in a room controlled by the problem it was meant to expose. That was not justice in the complete sense. Justice in the complete sense wasn't available. What was available was the unglamorous, persistent, ungrateful work of closing gaps and watching the places where they formed again and doing it again the next time. That was what she'd been doing for 14 months without recognition or institutional support, and it had worked, imperfectly, at enormous cost, in a way that required the specific and non-replicable chain of events that had brought her from a convoy turning south instead of north to a field outside Coldwater with a dog's head on her knee. She couldn't replicate the chain. She could change the conditions that made it necessary. The evening was coming in from the east, the temperature dropping in the clean way it dropped at elevation, and Ash was already moving toward the field gate with the purposeful energy of a dog who had assessed the situation and determined that it was time to go and eat something. She followed him. She was tired and her shoulder still ached, and she had a deposition addendum to file in the morning and a letter to write that wasn't the kind of letter that got easier with time. She walked through the gate. The mountains were still there behind her, dark now. The specific dark of terrain that had seen everything it was going to see and had no particular comment about any of it. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew what was there.